Welcome to our second week into the journey of Revelation. It's a different kind of week compared to what it was last week and what's going to be for the next few weeks, because we're dealing with the first three chapters of Revelation. And the first three chapters of Revelation are significantly different than the rest of the book. And that's because the first three chapters have to do with John of Patmos' message to 7 churches. Now, let's remember the context that Christianity was against the law. The worldview was that the world as they knew it was coming to an end. The end times were imminent. And John of Patmos writes this message of hope that we will be unpacking. And when you read the book of Revelation, it's hard to get into the situation that John of Patmos and the early Christians found themselves in, that had this worldview. And I think one of the ways you can get into this in terms of more recent history is the Holocaust. As I've mentioned before, from time to time, a friend insisted that many years ago, that I need to read the extremity literature. And the extremity literature is written by the survivors of the Holocaust, describing what it was like to be in the concentration camps. And in those concentration camps, hope was more than just a light at the end of the tunnel. That's how we sometimes look at hope. But rather it's a distant star in a moonless night. It's more than just a light at the end of the tunnel. It's a moonless night, it's dark, and it's a time of despair, and there's a distant star. And that's the foundation of hope. And so the survivors of the Holocaust would talk about that hope of seeing that distant star in the dark filled night. And so it was the power of love in those concentration camps. The star of love was going to be experienced in life or in death. That extremity literature taught me that on the other side of whatever happens, life or death, whether or not there is a tomorrow, as I know a tomorrow, on the other side there will be love. That's what I learned from the extremity literature. And I think in that sense, in the 20th century experience of the Holocaust, we can sort of crawl back into what it must have been when John of Patmos wrote the letter in about 95 AD. And so he begins the journey of the letter in an interesting way. And this is, he writes as if, the 7 churches have a life. And he writes these messages to the 7 churches. This is very, very significant. As those of a different language would say, muy importante, very important. Because John of Patmos did not write a letter to individual Christians scattered throughout Asia Minor. Nope, he addressed it to the gathered communities. You see, individual Christians were not any threat to the Roman Empire. What was a threat to the Roman Empire was the gathered communities that didn't believe in the divinity of the emperor. And so already 60 years after the death of Christ, just 60 years, the Christian movement was known by the gathered communities, not individuals. And so I think it's really important to call our attention at this point to say that there's a difference between a believer and a Christian. A believer is one who believes in God and has that as an individual belief. But a Christian is a person who's a part of a gathered community who have the common belief that the God of love was revealed in the life of Jesus and are committed to God's mission of love, to the star of Jesus, you might say, to the star of hope in dark times of despair. And so we have to understand, first of all, that in 95 AD, in a short period of time, Christians were those who were gathered in a community. It's not saying there's anything wrong with being a believer, but being a believer is different than being a Christian. And John of Patmos knew that as he wrote the letter to the churches in Asia Minor. We can unpack that more in discussion because it's really relevant in every age to realize the marked difference between Christians and other religious communities because of the insistence that Christians are those who are gathered in a community of faith. Now, he addressed these 7 churches, and I want to unpack that, and you can read the first 3 chapters. And as Deanna said, she read the whole book last week. Well, all you'd have to do is just read the first 3 chapters to understand fully what I'm going to unpack very quickly. And the first message was that the faithful church must not abandon agape, sacrificial and caring love. The church must not abandon love. And he said, the church at Ephesus, you have abandoned love. And this you must not do. For you are not faithful unless in your community there is caring and sacrificial love. Secondly, he says the faithful church must not be based on fear. And to the church at Smyrna, you must not be motivated by fear. Don't be afraid of the threat of going to prison because your faith is against the law. Don't be afraid of death because you might be thrown to the lions in the Colosseum to be entertained as you die by those who are watching the spectacle. No, fear has no real power. Agape love has power. Don't scare people and don't be scared yourself. Be motivated by love, not fear. And your problem in Smyrna is that you're afraid. No, the faithful church is not based on fear. Thirdly, the faithful church does not practice immorality. Now, Pergamum, the church in that city, was in a city that was pretty immoral, as according to almost any standard. And he referred to the immorality of Balaam, and you have to go back to Numbers, the 22nd chapter of Numbers, to understand what he was referring to. Because, immorality was an acceptable way of life, a legal way of life in that city. And therefore, the Christians in that city, they sort of practiced what was okay in that city in terms of behavior that, according to John of Patmos, was immoral. So the message is that what is legal is not necessarily moral. So the message to the church at Pergamon was the faithful church cannot practice immorality. Fourth, the faithful church must not follow false teaching. Indeed, Theatria, you have practiced idolatry, as the prophetess Jezebel taught. You have to read 1st and 2nd Kings to understand what John was referring to, because that's the story of Jezebel. But the faithful church cannot follow false teaching, and the standard for determining what is true or false teaching is the life and teachings of Jesus. Nothing more and nothing less. Fifth, the faithful church must remember. And Sardis, your problem is you have forgotten. You have forgotten Jesus. And you must always remember Jesus. One of the gospel accounts of Jesus having his Last Supper with the disciples, one of the writings include Jesus' statements, "Remember me." That's the reason we celebrate the sacrament today, is to remember Jesus, to remember the gift of the forgiveness of sins, to remember the life of sacrificial and caring love. And Sardis, your problem is you've forgotten already, and you must remember. You must be the community of remembrance. Sixth, the faithful church must have open doors. In Philadelphia, your doors are closed. The church in Philadelphia. Now remember, philia in Greek means brotherly love. And Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. Well, that's an ancient Greek city of Philadelphia. The church there did not have open doors. They had closed doors. They probably had a door and said, welcome if you agree with us. If you are our enemy, if you change, you're welcome. If you're a stranger, let's vet you before we let you in, because we're cleansed and more pure. And John of Patmos said, Philadelphia, you've got closed doors, and the faithful church has got to have open doors. Interestingly enough, that's the foundation of the understanding of the United Methodist Church that was put together a quarter of a century ago, that were the church of open doors, open minds, and open hearts. The open doors is straight out of the book of Revelation. Finally, seventh, the faithful church must not be lukewarm. And Laodicea, you're not on fire. You're not on fire for love. Your love has been tempered by wealth. And the faithful church must not be lukewarm. You must be on fire in terms of your your relationship with each other, and on fire for God's mission of love in the world. So we have these messages to the 7 churches. Now, 7 is important in Hebrew numerology because it's a symbol of perfection. And we see that historically, the 7 days of creation. That's because creation was whole at the end of the 7 days. And perfection does not mean without sin. Perfection means wholeness. So John Wesley, as he preached that you must be going on to perfection, he didn't say you go on to perfection by never committing a sin, by never missing the mark. He said you go on to perfection because you're going on to wholeness. And so John of Patmos began his journey of delivering the message of hope in times of darkness and despair. Indeed, by calling to accountability the early church. Just because the world is about to come to an end, just because Christianity is against the law, is no reason or excuse not to be faithful. And you see, for if no other reason than the first 3 chapters, Revelation belongs in the library of the early Christian movement. For think of this as the standard for the church anytime, including the end time. Let me review. The church must not abandon love. The church cannot be based on a message of fear. The church cannot practice immorality. It cannot follow false teaching. The church must be the community of remembering. The church must have open doors, and the church must be on fire for love. What a message for the early church. And so this week in our discussion coming on Sunday, we can talk about what it means to be the church today with these standards of the church set forward by John of Patmos. So let me lift some questions for discussion. First of all, what is your response to the distinction between being a believer and being a Christian? Secondly, which one of the 7 conditions in the churches in Asia Minor in 95 AD are most prevalent in the churches with which you're acquainted in 2021 AD? Thirdly, does the importance of the gathered community of the church that John of Patmos recognized reinforce your understanding of the importance of your commitment to the gathered community? Finally, where and how have you experienced hope as pointing to the star in times of darkness and despair? We'll look forward to Sunday. Thank you.